Good morning. Well then, hello. Good morning again. Thank you. Cole, would you word a prayer for us this morning? Amen. Last week we started to introduce the prophecy of Jeremiah, and we didn't start in the actual text of the book, but we want to continue to introduce not only Jeremiah, but introduce the prophecy that he put forward. Jeremiah consists of, the book of Jeremiah consists of a number of messages, a number, we would call them sermons, homilies or sermons. And those sermons had to do with a number of things, had to do with Israel's rebellion. In the words of Jeremiah, their backsliding, had to do with prophecy of with regard to being carried away into Babylon, had to do with the fact that they would be returned. Now, Jeremiah had some contemporary prophets. He had a prophet Israel had a prophet, or Judah had a prophet in Babylon in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Jeremiah was still alive when Judah was carried away into Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel, of course, was in the area of Babylon, teaching the natives there, or teaching the captives there. Nahum was contemporary. Nahum predicted the fall of Nineveh, and then Obadiah was somewhat contemporary with him, and he prophesied with regard to the fall of Edom. And then there were two prophets wherein we have written prophecies that were in the Jerusalem area. One of them was Habakkuk, and the reason we know that he was contemporary is that he talked about the Chaldeans, and let me just read a couple of verses here, a few verses. The burden of Habakkuk, the prophet did see, O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Why dost thou show me iniquity, and cause me to behold grievance? For spoiling and violence are before me, and there are that raise up strife and contention. Therefore the law is slacked, and judgment doth never go forth. For the wicked doth compass about the righteous. Therefore wrong judgment proceedeth. That's the social order in which Habakkuk was in. Behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I will raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess in the dwelling place that are not. Then in Zephaniah, likewise, talks about in his first chapter, talks about the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, and so whether or not Jeremiah, had contact with those prophets, we don't know. Whether or not he even knew them, we don't know that. There isn't any. Jeremiah doesn't make any written connection with them. Now, Jeremiah, according to Jeremiah, the 16th chapter and the second verse, just turning there for a moment, the 16th chapter, the second verse, Jeremiah was not permitted by God to be married. Jeremiah 16, 2-4. Let's just read that. Thou shalt not take a wife, neither shalt thou have sons or daughters in this place. For thus saith the Lord concerning the sons and concerning the daughters that are born in this place, and concerning their mothers that bear them, and concerning their fathers that begat them in this land. They shall die of grievous death. They shall not be lamented, neither shall they be buried, but they shall be as dung upon the face of the earth, and they shall be consumed by the sword and by famine, and their carcasses shall be meat for the fowls of heaven, the beasts of the field, and so on. Now, whether God was sparing Jeremiah of that, in his, if he had children, whether he was sparing them, or if there's some other reason. Now, I suppose if there was ever a person that needed a spouse, it was Jeremiah. If a spouse, is a helpmeet, like a spouse is supposed to be, because he suffered all kinds of persecution. I suppose when he was, and we're going to look at some passages here, I suppose when he was speaking, there was just outrage from the audience, because they didn't believe him. They didn't want to believe him. Let's look at some of the passages in Jeremiah wherein he suffered persecution. This will give us some context to when we get into the actual text of the scripture, the actual text of Jeremiah. In the 11th chapter of Jeremiah, the 18th verse, he says, and the Lord hath given me knowledge of it, and I knew it. Then thou showest me their doings. But I was like a lamb. Jeremiah speaking. I was like a lamb, or an ox that is brought to the slaughter, and knew not that they had devised devices against me, saying, let us destroy the tree with the fruit thereof, and let us cut him off from the land of the living, that his name may be no more remembered. Now, if a preacher or anyone in this social order were constantly, when their life was in danger at every turn, at every corner they turned, that would not be a particularly a good feeling. In 12:6, Jeremiah 12 and the 6th verse. For even thy brethren and the house of thy father, even they have dealt treacherously with thee. Now, what does that sound like? It's talking about thy house of thy father, even they have dealt treacherously with thee. Yea, they have called a multitude after thee. Believe them not, saith, or though they speak fair words unto them. Now, if your siblings, if your close relatives are treating you harshly, that's, it's one thing to have the world at large treating you harshly, but having your own family do so. In Jeremiah 14:13, Jeremiah 14:13, he was confronted by these false prophets. Then said I, O Lord God, behold the prophets, they say unto them. Let me start that over. Then said I, Lord, behold the prophets say unto them, ye shall not see the sword, neither shall ye have famine, but I will give you assured peace in this place. Now, Jeremiah, what was he saying? As a prophet of the Lord, what was he saying? He's saying that there's going to be destruction. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, are going to destroy this place because of the corruption in the Jewish social order. And these other prophets were coming along and saying, then the Lord said unto me, well, they were saying there's no destruction. Now the Lord said unto me, the prophets prophesy lies in my name. I sent them not, neither have I commanded them, neither spake unto them. They prophesy unto you a false vision and divination, and a thing of naught, and the deceit of their hearts. So, he's preaching, and right after him, or maybe in the same audience, maybe in the same, venue, these supposed prophets are saying, that's wrong. There's no problem here. We are of the seed of Abraham, like the Pharisees said. We are the chosen people. We are God's elect. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing bad's going to happen. Our country isn't going to be, our country isn't going to be destroyed. Our nation has existed for, these centuries and centuries. We're in good shape, so these false prophets, and I suppose, if every time you stood up to teach or preach, and you had people, giving negative feedback, that'd be pretty hard. I would think that would be pretty hard to endure. Sometimes it's hard enough to preach the truth when the audience is either neutral or affirmative. But think if you every time you turned around you had people challenging everything that you said, and that seems to be the situation there with Jeremiah. In the 15th chapter, the 10th verse, he received some pushback. Woe is me, my mother, that thou hast borne me a man of strife, and a man of contention to the whole earth. I have neither lent on usury, nor men have lent to me on usury, yet every one of them doth curse me. Now, every time he turned around, somebody was cursing him, saying negative things about him. in our life, if somebody says something negative once, what's our reaction sometimes? It's not good. But this seemed to be a continual problem for Jeremiah. In the 20th verse, or the 20th chapter rather, let's see what else confronted Jeremiah. Now, Pashur, in the 20th chapter, first verse, Pashur, the son of Immer, the priest. Now, I don't know whether this was a legitimate priest or not. He certainly wasn't, according to the record here, wasn't a good priest, who was also the chief governor in the house of the Lord. He was had to do with the administration of the temple, apparently. Heard that Jeremiah prophesied these things. What things? Well, the doom was coming unless there was major repentance. Then Pashur smote, or I suppose some other versions say beat him. They smote him and put him in stocks, or put him in prison that was in the high gate of Benjamin, which was by the house of the Lord. So beat him, put him in prison. It came to pass on the morrow that Pashur brought forth Jeremiah out of the stocks, so that he wasn't in there very long. But then that wasn't the last imprisonment that we have with regard to Jeremiah. Let's look at chapter 23 and verse 9. 23 and verse 9. Mine heart within me is broken. Because, why? Of the prophets. He was brokenhearted because of all the pushback from these so-called prophets. Those prophets didn't have any legitimacy with regard to God, but nonetheless they were there trying to influence the people. In chapter 26, in verse 8, now remember that Jeremiah prophesied during the reign of King Josiah, who was a good king and probably supportive, very supportive. I'm sure he was very supportive of Jeremiah's attempt to turn the people away from corruption. But he also was a prophet, a preacher, a teacher under some bad kings that followed Josiah. And we'll get that as when we get into the text of Jeremiah, we'll see that. So in that Jeremiah 26 and 8, again, came to pass when Jeremiah had made an end of speaking all that the Lord had commanded him to speak unto all the people, that the priests and the prophets and all the people took him, saying, Thou shalt surely die. Now, wouldn't that be something? Preaching his heart out, the words that God had given him, and what does the text say there in 26 and 8? He says, and all the people, that the priest and the prophets, and all the people took him. Now, the religious people, the priests, that would represent some form of religion, and the prophets, the other people that were supposed to be speaking religiously or on behalf of religion, on behalf of the Jews' religion, they as it says, then all the priests and the prophets and all the people. It's kind of like being run out of town on a rail, as they used to say in the early days of the country. This this poor guy was in a world of hurt. In 28, verse 1, let's look at, and it came to pass the same year, in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah. And by the way, Zedekiah was a bad actor. He's a bad king. Actually, the last king of Judah, and he was, of course, carried away into captivity. Sons were murdered in front of him, and so on. Eyes put out. Suffered a horrible latter days of his life. Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 4th year and in the 5th month, that Hananiah, the son of Azer, the prophet, see, there's another prophet, which was of Gibeon, spake unto me in the house of the Lord, in the presence of the priest, and of all the people, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, I have broken the yoke of Babylon. Here's this priest, the prophet, false prophet, coming along and said, he was very specific in his pushback to Jeremiah's prophecy, or his prophetic statements. He says, within 2 full years will I bring again into this place all the vessels of the Lord's house. Now, at this point in time, you see, Jerusalem was carried away in stages under Babylonian captivity. There were at least 3 stages of them being carried away. And at this point in time, Nebuchadnezzar's house had taken the vessels of the Lord's house. The temple hadn't been destroyed at this juncture, but they had taken the vessels from the Lord's house, or the temple. And so this prophet is saying, hey, I got a vision, I got a prophecy from God that within 2 years, everything's going to be okay. This is even after one or more raids on Jerusalem where captives were taken to Babylon. So you just have to empathize with the problems that Jeremiah endured. And in 32, chapter 32, and 2 and 3, 32, 2 and 3. For then the king of Babylon's army besieged Jerusalem. Jeremiah the prophet was shut up in the court of the prison, which was in the king of Judah's house. For Zedekiah, king of Judah, had shut him up, saying, Wherefore dost thou prophesy, and say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will give this city into the hand of the king of Babylon. He shall take it. And Jeremiah had also indicated that Zedekiah, the king of Judah, shall not escape out of the hands of the Chaldeans, but will surely be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon, and shall speak with him mouth to mouth, and his eyes shall behold his eyes. And he shall lead Zedekiah into Babylon, and there shall be unto him, and there shall he be until I visit him, saith the Lord. Though ye fight with the Chaldeans, ye shall not prosper. You see, Zedekiah had been allowed to continue to be a king, king of Judah, even after part of the people were carried away into Babylonian captivity. And then Zedekiah became a vassal state, became subjected to the Babylonian rule. He was just kind of a puppet leader, and he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and this is what this is all about here. So, but he had Jeremiah in prison. Well, in chapter 36 and 22, Jeremiah was leaving the area and was pursued and brought back. In Jeremiah 37:10, he was imprisoned one more time. In Jeremiah 38:6, he was falsely accused. Jeremiah 38:6, he was thrown in a dungeon. Now that was not a very good venue, obviously. A pit and mire and so on. And in 43:2 and 3, near the end of, after the complete carrying away of Judah, he was in 43:2 and 3. He was falsely accused. Now, this man Jeremiah was a persecuted prophet beyond measure. Maybe the most persecuted of all the prophets. Isaiah was persecuted, but maybe Jeremiah was persecuted beyond Now, there's some major themes, and we're going to get to chapter 1 here soon, but there are some major themes in the prophecy of Isaiah. He mentions that Judah was a backsliding people 13 times. He mentions that Judah had committed sin 53 times. Nobody likes to be admonished, right? Or very few people like to be admonished for wrongdoing, because they usually have a good excuse for why they did it, right? But 53 times, and 51 times Judah, he mentioned that Judah would eventually, a remnant would eventually return. 14 times he mentions that they would be scattered because of their sin, and they didn't believe that. He mentions that they would be captured, that Jerusalem would be captured at least 51 times. And so he was on the wrong side of the society of the Jewish community. So with that kind of flavor, let's then go to the first chapter of Jeremiah. And it reads, "The words of Jeremiah, the sons of Hilkiah, the priests, that were in Anathoth, in the land of Benjamin." That area was a priestly city. Anathoth was set aside for the Levites when the land was divided up. Now, last week I mentioned that this Hilkiah, who was the priest that found the book of the law in the temple. They were cleaning out the temple. Josiah was going through some reforms. They were cleaning out the temple, and they found the law. I mean, this society had literally lost the book, you see. And I mentioned that probably Hilkiah was the Hilkiah that was involved in this helping Josiah in the reform effort. Was probably the father of Jeremiah. Now, there's some speculation, there's some difference of opinion among scholars as to whether this was another Hilkiah, but nonetheless, I am confident that Jeremiah was helping with the reforms. I mean, he was preaching, he was teaching, he was admonishing, and that was part of what Josiah was doing. So the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priest, that were in Anathoth, in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. Now, let's get a little more historical context here. Manasseh was a bad character, a bad king. He was really a bad king. Now, Manasseh was hauled off to Babylon, and while in Babylon came to his senses, and he repented, and he came back and tried to make some reforms, but the social order had gone so far that a leader wasn't able to bring them back. But Ammon, so Jeremiah was there with Josiah, and he was, and of course Ammon, we said he was the son of Ammon, king of Judah, and it was in the 13th year of his reign. So we got a date here that Jeremiah began his prophet career, if we want to refer to it as a career. He began that in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah. And that was a good time for him because he would have had the support of the king. And it came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah. So it was Josiah, and then Jehoiakim, and then there was another king that's not mentioned here, Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, unto the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month. Now, Jeremiah's reign then, or Jeremiah's prophet, as a prophet, his period of time served was at least 40 years from the 13th year of Josiah up until the carrying away of them in captivity. And then he also, after the destruction of the temple, Jeremiah continued, and we'll see that he prophesied even after that. In fact, he was taken down into Egypt, but he was forced to go down into Egypt with some of the remnant. And it seems to me that it was against his will. So Josiah had a long history of being a prophet. Then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, now it's specifically into Jeremiah, behold, I formed thee in the belly. I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Now, what do we get out of that verse? Yeah, we get out of that verse that through God's natural law, and in this case there might have been some, miraculous manifestations, but through God's natural law, he forms children in the womb. Now that ought to give pause to anyone that has a bizarre view of abortion. Hey, God's laws are working to form children in the womb. And I knew thee. Well, how could God know Jeremiah before Jeremiah was a speaking adult? How could God know Jeremiah in the womb? Tim, that's a preacher question. That's a question for a preacher. I mean, life must have been, this embryo must have been a person, right? Would that be right? How else would you? God knew him in the womb. I mean, that's pretty simple, isn't it? Pardon me? Yeah. Yeah. So, um, he says, before I formed thee in the womb, I knew thee. And before thou camest out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. We mentioned this a little bit last week, but how could he be a prophet unto the nations? He was a prophet in Judah. How could he be a prophet to the nations? He did in the latter part of his prophecy, in the book of prophecy, his prophecy, he did in fact prophesy with regard to other nations, but in what sense would he prophesy, be a prophet of the nations? How would he be? I mean, did what happened in Judah affect what happened in the other nations? It must have. Who directed Babylon to capture Israel or Judah? He raised them up. He raised up Assyria to capture the northern tribes. He raised up Babylon to capture Jerusalem, the Judah area. That little piece of real estate around Jerusalem, was a major player in the world community for centuries. And so he was. Now, let's suppose you got the message. Let's suppose you were in a decadent society, an awful society, an unrighteous society. That is, your own countrymen were unrighteous. They were despicable. And you got the message from God. I'm going to raise you up to be a prophet of the nations. What's going to be your reaction? What would be your reaction? I know what my reaction would be. I'm not equipped for this job, right? I can't handle this. Don't put that weight on my back. But Jeremiah, he embraced it enthusiastically, right? Well, let's see. He said, oh Lord God, behold, I can't speak. I cannot speak, for I'm a child. Kind of like Moses, wasn't it? This weight's too heavy for me. Probably, some people speculate that Jeremiah was in his teens when he received this directive. I don't know. Could have been. He says he's a child. Any of their translations use a different term than child? Pardon me? Youth? Yeah. One thing about it, he was no spring chicken, right? He was not. He was. All right. He was a spring chicken. Yeah, and that's. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the way and some people, some people, and some of the commentators say that it could have been as 30, could have been, some as little as young as 14, others as old as 30. But in any respect, what's the age in our Constitution of the you can't be president until you're what, 35? Yeah, so I got the Jeopardy guy here to give us that information. Anyway, we whether it was 14 or 30, we don't know. But he said, "Well, I'm just a kid." But the Lord said unto me, "Say not that I'm a child, for thou shalt go to all that I shall send thee, and whatsoever I command thee, thou shalt speak." So he was given a commission and was, in fact, promised that God would be with him. Now, we have ambassadors today, right? And sometimes those ambassadors, we have people representing the president, and sometimes those and they have full authority from the president, right? But if they disagree with the president, what happens? They get fired. We've seen a lot of firing here lately, from representatives of presidents. But God gave him this awesome commission, this weighty commission, and said, I'm going to be with you. Not only am I going to be with you, I'll command you what you speak. I don't suppose Jeremiah had spent a lot of time, in the wee hours of the morning preparing sermons. Do you think? I don't think so. What do you think, Tim? You probably have to prepare. But, maybe you don't. But God was going to tell him. It's kind of like the Apostle Peter on the day of Pentecost. God was giving him words. Well, we'll start there next week.